You very much once again to this pre-lunch session that we have. Dr. Joan Bondarev was kind enough to come and give us a different perspective. So far, I believe we've had quite a number of interesting perspectives on the issue of maritime safety, from the very general conceptual things that Dr. Levinson spoke about to very specific initiatives like Mike Brown just spoke to us about. And we've had the perspective of Dr. Pilbaud, and we have the different perspectives. But here Joan is going to speak to us about the management of risk for port safety. And the perspective that she's going to take is the legal perspective. Yesterday I spoke a little bit about that with some of you about the insurances and premiums, and I was particularly interested in the apnea thing that Barry was speaking about. So well, I'll let Joan introduce herself. Please, Joan, thank you.
Muchas gracias, Jorge. Nice to be here today. Carlene Leidenkluss invited me to come and talk to you about the liability in the case of safety or security incidents, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to do it primarily from the security point of view because that's where a lot of litigation has been focused. And I'm going to start out with a review of where we've been in port security in the United States, what's happening, where are we going, some of the legal challenges, the litigation, and then I'm going to talk about the unmet challenges. As for myself, I've been a maritime attorney in Washington for many years now, and I'm affiliated with Blank Rome Law Firm. And I used to work on the Hill as a committee counsel, so I do a lot of work on legislation as well. And my new passion is offshore wind and renewable energy. I'm on a Virginia Offshore Wind Development Commission. So if you want to talk about renewable energy, I'm happy to do that afterwards. So because lawyers speak too many words, I didn't do a PowerPoint. I really have prepared remarks in a speech, which you don't have yet, but I'm happy to transmit a copy to Jorge after this, and you can have all of the details in what I've put together for you. So here we go, a little bit, the history of port security in the United States, the successes and the challenges to come. Of course, as we all know, when two airplanes struck the World Trade Center in New York on 9/11, 2001, the U.S. not only woke up to the dangers of terrorism, but we realized that terrorists could strike our shores as well. And Congress and the country became united behind trying to prevent another incident such as this. And so far, we've been pretty successful. The attention was first placed on aviation safety, understandably, because the terrorists struck the World Trade Center towers with airplanes, and as well as the Pentagon, and then aiming at the U.S. Capitol. So Congress initially passed major aviation safety legislation, from which we have the Transportation Security Administration and all of the rigors of cargo and passenger screening that have become a way of life. It's hard to believe at times that we haven't had a TSA in our lives, but it's only been, 12 years. At the same time, Congress turned its attention to maritime security, and in 2002 passed the Major Maritime Transportation Security Act, which Captain Brown referred to. And that has established the regime for maritime and port security in the United States that we follow to this day. The law has been amended a few times, but the basic principles remain the same. And of course, as you know, the MITSA, as we call it, the acronym, was intended to implement the ISPIS, or International Ship and Port Facility Security Code, and it follows that code to a large extent. And of course, you all as port and or flag states, nations are bound by that code as well. The basic requirements then were the establishment of the Area Maritime Security Committees chaired by the Coast Guard, conduct of vulnerability assessments for ports, vessels, cruise ships, and facilities of a certain size, It's hard to believe, but we hadn't done any vulnerability assessments up till then. Completion of maritime security plans for ports, vessels, cruise ships, and facilities, also to be approved by the Coast Guard, and intended to have regular drills and exercises. The requirements for 24-hour notice before a ship could enter a U.S. port. The carriage of automated identification systems, or AIS, for most commercial and large passenger vessels. And finally, the requirements for biometric identification cards, or TWIC cards, as they've come to be known. At the same time, first without legislation and then later, the Customs and Border Protection Bureau of the newly created Department of Homeland Security established 3 major international cargo screening programs: the Secure Freight Initiative, the Container Security Initiative, and the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, which has become known as CTPAT. And as I said at the time, I gave Robert Bonner, the first administrator of CBP, a lot of credit, because what he realized, which is obvious to all of you, is that commerce is an international business. In the United States, we have 10 million containers or more that come into the United States every year. And they don't come from nowhere. They come from your ports, they come from European ports, they come from Asian ports, all Latin American ports. And so I think his concept was an excellent one, which is to push the borders out and see if, as much as possible, cargo containers, before they come into U.S. ports, could be screened for any hazardous materials or potentially weapons of mass destruction. And that program of partnerships with other ports around the world, with ports such as yours under the Secure Freight Initiative, the CTPAT program, which now includes over 6,000 shippers, all major importers of the United States belong to that program, have really been successful in securing our ports and our homeland since MITSA was passed. Congress has tinkered with MITSA a few times. We had the Safe Port Act of 2006, and following that, the 9/11 Commission Act of 2007, all intended to strengthen MITSA. One of the things that the 9/11 Commission Act did was to impose a new requirement that all cargo containers, before they entered the United States, would be scanned 100% as opposed to screening. As you know, it's only a portion of containers that are actually screened for weapons of mass destruction or other radiological materials. And this 9/11 Commission that was created many years later to look at where things stood in terms of homeland security came out with a recommendation that this was too small a percentage and that all containers had to be scanned for WMD. This has really been a controversial requirement, both in the United States and overseas. I know the EU took a strong position against it. And over time, the United States has drawn back somewhat from that requirement. The law also allowed the Secretary of Homeland Security to waive the requirement in 2-year increments if she, Secretary Napolitano at the time, found that it was technically infeasible and economically too expensive to have a 100% scanning requirement. That 2-year waiver expires this summer, and I imagine that the new Secretary of Homeland Security probably will extend it as well. Although I've read recently that many new technologies for scanning in a speedy manner are coming online, so I think sometime in the near future we will revisit that issue of 100% scanning versus screening, because right now only 5 to 6% of the containers are actually physically inspected. So the first question I asked myself, has the MITSA regime and the ISPS regime been successful? I would have to say yes, because to my knowledge, there have been no major terrorist incidents at a U.S. port. I imagine some threats have been prevented, and I hope that's the case, but I'm certainly not privy to those, but I hope that's so. But the question always is, can more be done? And I will return to that question at the end of my remarks after I indicate to you what the liability standards are and what has happened in courts over these incidents. So responsibility, as you know, and I'm sure it's true in many of your reports too, is divided between public entities and private tenants. Most U.S. ports are managed by public entities or government entities, but then the tenants, the owners and operators of the actual facilities, the terminals, the vessels, et cetera, are owned by the private sector. So we have in the United States divided responsibility as well, therefore, as divided liability. Initially, the public ports have been granted what we call sovereign immunity, which means that they are not held liable even in the event of a terrorist incident at their port. Actually, there was an early incident at the World Trade Centers that some of us have forgotten. In 1993, terrorists entered the World Trade Towers through a garage entrance and did a lot of damage, and lives were lost then. And there was litigation against the New York and New Jersey Port Authority, and they were found to have exercised reasonable care in that case, and they were granted sovereign immunity, so nobody could recover damages from them. You know, today I wonder whether that same situation would apply. On the other hand, I do recommend for those of you who manage public ports that you go back and review your country laws and determine whether you are eligible for sovereign immunity. Stepping back from that, then you have the responsibility and liability of the port tenants themselves and all the private companies that work in and around the ports. They have been sued in the past, and they will continue to be. And there are various levels of protection that all of those tenants enter into. They can qualify to purchase terrorism insurance. It's quite expensive. I just read an article that said that only 14% of tenants do have some form of terrorism risk insurance. Of course, they can have standard risk insurance and interruption of business policies. And then they have in the United States, I'll come back to in a minute, something called the Safety Act, which protects them also in case they've deployed technologies and there is an incident of terrorism. After 9/11, there was just a wide range of litigation against tenants, against airlines, against American Airlines in particular, and against insurance companies. And some of that litigation, you know, it took many, many years to resolve. For example, just last year, the final lawsuit was settled between Cantor Fitzgerald, an occupant of the North Tower of the World Trade Centers, and American Airlines. Cantor Fitzgerald was one of those companies, a trading firm in New York, that occupied the top floors of the North Tower. They were particularly badly hit. They had over 650 employees who lost their lives on that day. So they naturally, you know, decided who they were going to sue. They sued American Airlines for $1 billion, and last year the case was settled for a little under $200 million, which just goes to show you you can sue for whatever you want to, but sometimes you'll settle for a lesser figure. So that case just resolved very, very recently. At the same time, all the tenants who occupied the World Trade Center didn't sue the Port Authority necessarily because of sovereign immunity, but they also filed many, many claims against their insurance companies, some based on risk insurance, some based on standard insurance, some based on terrorism insurance policies, and those cases have gone through the courts recently, and some of them are still ongoing. Many of the tenants of the World Trade Center argued that they should have disruption of their business coverage until they were able to return to the World Trade Center. As we know, a new World Trade Center is just being built in downtown New York City. It hasn't opened to tenants yet, so the interruption of business would have taken many, many years, and the courts decided that that was too much coverage. They really weren't entitled to it, but if they could open a store nearby in another location, that's as far as the coverage would extend to the interruption of the business between the date of the old business and the new one in a nearby location. So there are many cases that have gone through the courts about what's the scope of the insurance and how much can you recover. But of course, most of the tenants of these ports have a combination of risk insurance, standard insurance, and some have even terrorism insurance. So the 4 levels of protection for ports and the terminal owners and operators include sovereign immunity, which many of you may be entitled to, terrorism insurance, standard insurance policies, and the United States, I'll mention something we have that you might want to look into, which is called the Safety Act, which is SAFETY Act. Under that act, companies who provide technologies or services to ports or other critical infrastructure are entitled to certain protections that are granted by the Department of Homeland Security. They can have technologies that would be deployed at a port, for example, computer software, they could have perimeter fences, they could have guards, whatever. And Congress was particularly worried that they would never act at another port again if they didn't get some protection. So these companies can apply to the Department of Homeland Security, and they can have their technologies qualified as official anti-terrorism technologies. If they are so designated, their liability is capped to a certain level of their insurance. And if they get a next tier of protection, which is called certified technologies, then they have the equivalent of contractor or government immunity in the case of a terrorist attack. So the Safety Act was very important to allow businesses to continue to do work in this kind of environment. I just want to raise a few issues that it seems to me have been unmet and that are future security challenges for our ports, and I'm sure yours as well. And some of those issues were raised earlier. In the first place, we really haven't taken care of the small recreational vessels or the fishing vessels. I know the Coast Guard has been worried about this. I'm sure many of you remember the USS Cole incident, and that was attacked by a small vessel. So to this day, I don't think we have a very good maritime domain awareness of what the small vessels are entering the ports, who they belong to. I mean, of course, 90% of them are going to be innocent, but there's that other small percentage that might not be. AIS, it's not required for all vessels. It has to be a vessel of a certain size and tonnage. Cybersecurity is the newest challenge that you face and that we all face in the United States. I'm going to return to that in a minute. Declining budgets. We have sequestration here. We have the tightening of the belt, financial belts. We have declining Coast Guard budgets. We have new areas that the Coast Guard needs to monitor now, including the Arctic. And there's been a decline in grants that DHS gives out to our ports in the form of port security grants. That program was initially authorized at $400 million, but the last appropriation was only $100 million. To divide that up among the 360 ports in this country, it doesn't go very far. The readers for TWIC cards, that has been a challenge. The Coast Guard has put out final rules, but I'm not sure how well that program has been implemented. The debate over container scanning versus screening, that will continue. The 100% rule, it's being deployed for aviation cargo, but it's still a challenge in the maritime environment. Container security devices, it makes a lot of sense to have a lock, something tamper-proof on containers and vessels, but I don't think that we've really figured out what the best device is for that. Perimeter security, it occurs to me after this stowaway just boarded a Hawaii Airlines plane and was able to get all the way to Hawaii, and he walked off the plane amazingly, or he was in a coma when he got there. So I think we're going to pay more attention to perimeter security. If an airport can be breached that way, certainly a port could be breached that way. I just want to return briefly and in conclusion to cybersecurity because it is an ongoing challenge for all of us who use credit cards, for all of us who use the World Wide Web, for all of us who conduct business in this critical environment. I think cybersecurity is the great challenge that we have upon us. In the United States, President Obama issued an executive order laying out his principles for cybersecurity and assigning certain tasks to various agencies. The Commerce Department has come up with a new framework of best management practices, but we don't have any binding legislation. The House has passed legislation, the Senate has not, so there's no final legislation to require the imposition of cybersecurity standards across all the regimes of critical infrastructure, including ports. I think it's coming, but we don't have it yet, and I think the threat is a great one. So I would say in conclusion that our security regimes have worked fairly well in the United States, but if we ever had a situation where a bomb would be detonated in a container in a port in the United States, it would certainly wreak havoc on our economy and I think on our collective psyche. And at that point, as Congress always does when there's a new problem, then they'll go back to the drawing board and see if new legislation is required. And that's certainly what they've done after many major accidents, is respond to it that way. In the meantime, I wish you all well. I hope you're all practicing safe port security and safety practices, and I hope you don't have any bad events at your ports. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, John. I'm sure there'll be some questions. Thank you very much, Joan. And again, while the audience thinks of some questions, I just want to thank you and to point out that this is a very real issue. I mean, the legal perspective, I think the 7, 8 sort of pending issues that you mentioned are highly useful. And I was talking this morning about, insurance and liability and because of the different accidents that can happen and whatnot. Anyway, so we have a super duper expert here, and I think, Professor, you have a question? And then Curtis, and then back there.
Do I need
You're
this?
gonna need that.
Hablo un poco español, pero no está bastante por todas las preguntas. Gracias.
En el caso del stock, ayer recordaba la doctora que el caso del stock del pozo petrolero en 1982, Pemex fue beneficiario del principio de inmunidad soberana. Usted lo ha mencionado en reiteradas ocasiones, que es una condición que protege a los países de alguna manera en algunos litigios de esa magnitud. En el caso de las reformas que está haciendo México en este momento, en la privatización del petróleo, que mucho se va a hacer a través de empresas privadas, ¿esta condición se va a perder ante los tribunales de los Estados Unidos? La condición de inmunidad soberana, el beneficio que se tiene en el derecho internacional de acudir o evocar a ese principio, ¿se va a perder con tanta privatización de las actividades petroleras en el Golfo?
It's a good question. And I think the government-run side of the business will retain the sovereign immunity, but the private companies will not to varying degrees. You can see in the United States through the Safety Act, we tried to give them greater protections. None of those companies have been sued yet, so we don't know how that will work, but you might consider that kind of legislation. There's a whole Safety Act program that's on the DHS website, and they're very accessible to talking to you about that and seeing whether that would be a good model for your country. But I don't think you will lose it, but the companies involved may not have it. Correct.
Thank you.
Gracias.
¿Puedes apagar tú? Gracias, thank you. Curtis.
Thank you very much. Can you just kindly expand on the sovereign immunity again for me, please?
I think it goes back to a British concept, of course, in the law, which is that the sovereign is immune, the king is immune, and somehow, because most of our law is based on British law and European law, we have retained that principle. And I guess the theory is that the king can do no wrong. But that's why I hedged it a little bit, because perhaps in the future, that immunity would be pierced if the sovereign did do some wrong. I think that earlier case in the New York State Court of Appeals about the '93 incident at the World Trade Center was a little glib to my taste. I mean, that court said that the port exercised reasonable care, didn't have to do anything else about the garage. I don't know that a court in a similar circumstance would do the same thing. But government entities in the United States, government agencies, the government, qua the government, cannot be sued for damages under that longstanding principle of law.
Hello? No, I think the gentleman in the back.
Yeah, I moved over here.
Moved over.
Hi, I'm Duncan Smith, and I'm here with Carlene from NAMEPA, and proud to have been a colleague of Joan's for a long time in many iterations. And Joan, the question I have is, after 9/11, you spoke about all the liabilities that have resulted and the different things, but the government itself has made adjustments. We have a new Department of Homeland Security. So in the executive branch, there were all these adjustments that were made. And then on Capitol Hill, our Congress made adjustments by creating new committees, Homeland Security, oversight, and that sort of thing. In your view, has any of that reorganization, if you will, either affected liability or affected the obligations that people have to comply with these principles that you talked about?
Well, as you know, Duncan, and I acknowledge that I worked with Duncan for a long time, and I told him he wasn't allowed to heckle me today, so here we go. There was a big debate in the United States whether you should reorganize the deck chairs on the ship, so to speak, and create new federal agencies. The president at the time, I guess it was President Bush, wanted to do everything by executive order and keep Tom Ridge, his Homeland Security advisor, close to him in the White House. But Congress, and there were several senators, Senator Lieberman, Senator Collins, were very interested in creating a new department by legislation. At the time, I remember reading a quote that said, it's taken, 40 or 50 years to really have a modern Department of Defense that was created, that many years ago. I think we really are in the infant stages of the Department of Homeland Security. I just read something today that said that Secretary Jed Johnson now, is trying to get the department to operate more cohesively. He is in charge of 22 disparate agencies, including the Coast Guard, the Secret Service, FEMA, Customs Border Protection, TSA. I mean, he's got a huge responsibility, but they all are individual fiefdoms. So I guess the question is, are we safer because we've created that kind of an organization, or would it have worked as well, without doing that? I think it's hard to say. I mean, we've been lucky because it has worked, but I don't know whether I give the reorganization that kind of credit.
Good day, Doctor. In Trinidad and Tobago, at the Port of Port-of-Spain, we have a little problem. Sometimes, as you introduce yourself as a maritime attorney also, what happened is that the coastal state jurisdiction, port state detention, and sometimes flag state, innocent passage of ship, demurrage, all of this is activated into one, and sometimes there is a claim, and it goes back and forth, and I don't know if you could add some clarity in that, especially from the Admiralty law side of it.
I don't know, the specific facts in your country. I'd be glad to advise you separately about it. But we have a similar problem in the United States, and I was going to say this at the outset. I mean, we really have a multi-tiered approach to security in the United States, and a multi-tiered approach to almost everything, because we have the federal level, we have the state and local level, you have the ports, and then you have the people who operate the ships and the terminals in the ports. And so the liability tiers down, and it usually falls downhill to the lowest level. And then you have the various international jurisdictions. So after 9/11, we extended our territorial sea from 3 miles out to 12 miles in accordance with, the principles of the law of the sea, which embarrassingly the United States refuses to ratify, and that's just another topic of which I'm mortified. So you have the territorial sea, and you have innocent passage through there. You have transit passage through the EEZ. So a lot of this depends on where the event occurs. Or as I always say, you can't prevent people from suing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the individual who's going to be liable. And it could be that in your case, it's going to be a joint liability.
Dr. Bondaroff, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. James Spear with NMEPA, and I am a seafarer myself. I was wondering if you could speak for a minute regarding your thoughts concerning the integration of systems, particularly in light or in the context of what you mentioned, security as a vulnerability within the system. Europe's moving forward, to my understanding, with Mona Lisa and Mona Lisa 2.0. And I was wondering if you could speak for a minute about what your thoughts are about how much that may gain traction here in the Americas, because it's my understanding that some port states and flag states may have security concerns with an increased paperless navigation, let alone an increased fully integrated vessel management and voyage management system.
I'm not familiar with Mona Lisa, I'm sorry, but somehow it reminds me there was a program on television Sunday night, and it was publicly available, anybody could see this, and it talked about the missiles and how the missiles are stored in the United States. And they have a security system in one of those storage sites that uses such an old system, it has floppy disks attached to it. And when the Air Force general was interviewed about, well, shouldn't you change to modern computers, he said, no, we've been advised that we can protect ourselves better this way with the old system than with the new system. And for myself, since my credit card has been compromised 3 times in the past 6 months, and I keep getting new credit cards, I definitely think the U.S. has to go to a different credit card system, and I think the one that Europe uses has got to be better than, with the chip, has got to be better than what we're doing right now. But I don't know that specific system.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Carlene Leiden-Kluss with NMEPA, and I'm one of those idea people. And this may be an incredibly naive idea, but because we have the benefit of so many ports here from that, I thought I'd throw it out there. Joan, you spoke about frankly, the lack of feasibility for 100% screening of containers. Would there ever be support from the United States government for helping underwrite a transshipment center, a regional transshipment center in the Caribbean, in the Gulf, that would encourage containers coming into the region from these super large ships, to use that as a transshipment center? The U.S. could finance the screening for containers going up to the States, and that could also provide a feeder system for shipping companies to the various other ports within the region.
I like the idea. I think it's creative. I think it's thinking outside the box. And also, I've read recently, maybe you've read it also, that a new 100% scanning technology is actually being tested in the Freeport, Bahamas as we speak. And they've found that they can do it in a very rapid manner. So delay in commerce has been less of an issue. So I think as these new technologies are developed, that will come to fruition at some point. I like it.
Well, I lived in Malta for a while, about 12 years ago, and Malta became a transshipment center, and the United States funded a screening system there, and this was before 9/11.
Yeah, the technology was tested at 3 ports a long time ago, including Singapore. I think General Electric had the technology that was tested there. And I'm not privy to the test results, but even so, the department felt that it wasn't feasible and it would impede commerce. But I think it's improving, and I think we're going to get there someday.
Thank you, Joan, very much. I think that that idea that was put forth is an interesting concept, and I hope that is picked up by some of the delegates here. And of course, the Secretariat would be at your service to to get anything started. I am a fervent believer in technology, but I'm also a realist in saying that, as new technologies come out, new ways to go around them and to beat them will definitely come around. And as you spoke about small vessels and so forth, I'm sure, because of what you do, most of you have been at sea and seafaring crafts, and some of us who have been lucky enough to have one, now that I'm here doing these things, I think about with these small crafts, recreational yachts or sailboats, the things that you could get away with if you actually, because once they know you, once the guard knows you, you just, hey, peace and love them, and you just cruise by, and they would never, ever once in years stopped to check me or my family or my where we intent on doing harm, we would have been able to do so without.
Well, recreational boaters in the United States, and I'm sure in your states as nations as well, are a very strong constituency. And it was difficult enough to get transportation workers to warm up to the idea of TWIC cards, which I'm sure they haven't really warmed up to. But to try to impose that kind of an identification requirement on fishermen or recreational boaters, it's never going to happen here. But, again, if there's an incident, then I never say never.
Right. Thank you very much. Please just give Joan a hand. Thank you for an excellent presentation. And again, like yesterday, I bid you to pick up some food. We have a different variety of light fare today. And as you know, the seats are way in the back. And we will be back here in, let's say, about 1. So we have some networking time, and we'll just throw everything 15 minutes.
And I'll leave you my card in case you want copies or have any follow-up questions. Please come get them.